Looks like we're live here again. Warm welcome to you, a very warm welcome on this day to you for our Tuesday edition of Table Talk. I'm coming to you live, and I'm here in our auditorium. We've got the air conditioning running in the office, as you can imagine. Hopefully you do as well where you are. And it's just a little quieter then on the stage in the auditorium. So I thought I'd use this as our backdrop today. We're going through, as you know, The Gospel Comes with a House Key, written by Rosaria Butterfield. We're in chapter 5 this week, and it's an important chapter, and every week I struggle to highlight, a few pages. I'm reading as a few pages every week, and then trying to make some summary comments as well. And this one's maybe particularly difficult. It's a long chapter, almost 30 pages, and I've come down to a few that I can read. And I'll do my best to kind of summarize it. But again, I'm really just trying to whet your appetite, and hopefully you go out and get the book. It's an important chapter because it's actually called the title of the book. The title and the chapter title are the same. The Gospel Comes with a House Key. And she looks in this chapter at really the house, seeing the house as both hospital and incubator. Hospital and incubator, and I think some of the challenges Christians have in seeing their homes or equipping their homes or enabling their homes to be a place that both heals the sick but also nurtures those of their own children, for instance. And parents sometimes see these things as at odds. How do I both love my children but love my neighbor? We'll talk about that more a little later. I'm going to start then with actually the first page in the chapter and read a story that comes from May, I think, of 2014. May of 2014. And at this point, they're located, her and her husband Kent, in Durham, North Carolina. Kent and I do a lot of public speaking these days. Our Christian neighbors know that we are conservative Christians who appear to run a commune at our house. Sometimes local church pastors invite us to explain what we do in our house and why. May 8th, 2014, under a stunning cloudless Carolina sky, Kent and I gathered up the kids after family devotions and headed to a local Baptist church to give a talk about loving the stranger. Before we left the house, we gave Sally and Bella their treats, red Kongs with frozen peanut butter. Those are their dogs, not the peanut butter. Sally and Bella. I keep a supply in the freezer. We were in a hurry, and we left our Bibles on the table. They were open to the Gospel of Luke. Before I left my house, I looked back and saw that the Bibles made a rough square on the dining room table with some Legos and plastic dinosaurs and one lightsaber. We locked the doors behind us, both the knob and the deadbolt. Our talk went well, we think. We hope we encouraged other Christian families to open their homes and see Jesus in those in need. We focused on philoxenia, the love for the stranger. And this is for Christian audiences a hard sell. Christians love to fellowship with like-minded people. Strangers can be another story. We answered good questions about how to develop relationships with people who do not share our class or background. We piled Knox and Mary back into the car and made the hour drive back home, covering familiar territory. It was a good day, and I was looking forward to getting home, making coffee, finishing the laundry, icing my injured foot, and reading the last chapter of Prince Caspian to the children. It does sound like a good day, mostly. I knew something was wrong as soon as I walked into the house. My ever-hyper, effervescent, and effusive golden retriever, Sally, was cowering in the corner, hurt and scared. Clothes and dining room plates and family pictures were strewn everywhere. As we walked into the kitchen, we saw it. A window had been snapped at the frame and popped out with a crowbar. The robbers had to stand on the large dog-feeding station to crawl in through the broken window, so obviously they weren't threatened by big dogs. Covering our open Bibles were those things the robbers discarded, some of my mum's china, and the golden-colored bowl that Kent uses for baptisms. Seeing the golden baptism bowl next to the Bibles was the only recognizable image in this whole picture. I looked at my hurt dog and kissed her face. She wagged at me gingerly, but her heart wasn't in it. I walked through the house as if underwater. Sally trailed cautiously behind. The robbers had yanked my mum's television off the wall, leaving holes in the wall and floor, where I suspect they must have dropped it. The drawers, and to all the dressers hung open, and their contents were strewn everywhere. Socks, geography puzzle pieces, math videos, marbles, the dog's heart pills. The robbers stole all my jewelry, including my engagement ring, an heirloom that had been in Kent's family for 5 generations. I always feared that I would hurt it or lose it if I wore it, especially during summer months when my hands are deep in garden dirt, when they are not holding children or turning book pages or kneading communion bread. I had stared at it just that morning, contemplating whether it was safe to wear that day, and I turned down what turned out to be my last chance. My mother, who had recently moved to a retirement home, had gifted me with her family jewelry, all of it, for safekeeping and memory's sake. They took it all. My mother had recently been raging because of another family issue. My estranged nephew had reached out to me and not to her, and of course she discovered this on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook or any social media, but the rest of the world is, and that is how she uncovered this. I was too worn out to even create a strategy for how to tell her what had happened or how to protect myself from her fury. All I could think was, this is the hand of God. Lean into it. The robbers took it all. But the close-range guilt was Sally, my golden, the most extroverted member of our family, who had never been mistreated by anyone except a cat in her whole lifetime. As a golden, she didn't know what mean was. Yet there she was, bruised, sad, shivering. When the police came, they explained it like this: big dogs are in the way, and robbers either shoot them or bludgeon them. Sally wasn't shot, and I thank God for that. The police took our information, fingerprinted every doorknob and doorframe, and left more mess and dirt in their wake. It was awful to be robbed. It was ironic to realize that as we advocated for hospitality to the stranger, a stranger beat my dog and walked off with the goods, vandalizing the house just for good measure. We were all in a state of shock. My children's anxiety rocketed through the roof. Not one of us found okay for months. But that night, when dinner time rolled around, our people surrounded us. I was not serving but receiving. Our people, our family of God, set the table. Matthew, my dear son in the Lord, and an exchange student from Singapore, was scheduled to move into our house that night, as the residence hall at the University of North Carolina was closing for the semester break. It was good to have his calming spirit to help. Susanna was just leaving work and picked up a rotisserie chicken and butter pecan ice cream on her way to our house. She knew I would need butter pecan, so she picked up some Lactaid too. As is my routine, I moved the prize Kroger chicken from its plastic bed to the pan, and then gave Sally the plastic container covered in chicken grease and juice. She settled down with it in her favorite posture, nose in the corner, and back feet splayed like a water buffalo in yoga, as if she could hide 90 pounds simply by giving us her backside. She held the plastic dish between her paws and started to perk up when more friends trailed in. Our homeschool dad friends came with tools and scripture, dropping their lawn care and important executive jobs to help. And after dinner and Bible reading and prayer and a psalm to sing, we started with a bucket and a rag, garbage bags, and a vacuum cleaner. It was hard to be robbed. It was hard to have God test so powerfully and privately what we proclaim publicly, that even if you are hurt, people can't take the things that matter most and that will survive to the new heavens and new earth. Your soul, His Word, and your someday glorified body. The day after we were robbed, Kent pushed the grill to the front yard, where the picnic table was already waiting. Then he posted 3 things on our Nextdoor app. We were robbed. Robbers took stuff, but no one was harmed, and the robbers could not take things of eternal value, the Word of God and the souls of people. And finally, we would love everyone to join us for burgers and hot dogs on the Lord's Day starting at 3 o'clock. He pushed send. Then Susanna pointed out that Sunday was Mother's Day, and my husband had just invited 300 people to our front yard. Well, that is how things go at the Butterfields. Kent also invited the whole church to come. He wanted to make sure that there would be plenty of believers to help our unbelieving neighbors process the robbery. That was always Kent's strategy. Have a house filled with God's people who can then help our neighbors see the hand of God in everyday details of life, including the providence of being robbed. It was a joy-filled time, with hot dogs and kids and water guns and meeting new and old friends. 21 neighbors showed up, and most of our church family as well. And when our unbelieving and skeptical neighbors asked how we were holding up, Kent was able to share the gospel with a new legitimacy, because where God is in your loss matters more to a doubting and cynical world than where God is in your plenty. It was hard to be robbed. It was awful to come home and find our house ransacked, holes in the walls, underwear touched by wrong hands, journals and vitamins tossed all over the floor, and the dog we had raised from mitten size bruised and fearful. It was humiliating to not be sovereign over locked doors and heirloom engagement rings. It ached to take in that He who is sovereign allowed this to happen, for His glory and for my own good. But it must feel deceptive and sinister to the people who robbed me, bad in a way that a coat of paint and a comfort of friends bearing rotisserie chicken and butter pecan ice cream can't fix. It must create a hole in their humanity that they know will someday swallow up everyone they love. When I was sitting at the table, eating our meal and taking and processing what had happened and praying, Bibles open, kids on laps, dogs under feet, feasting on our daily bread in the midst of a house ransacked by robbers, the chaos of invasion everywhere but the one room in which we gathered, I realize it. I am blessed. I am grateful. I'm not the victim. It was more awful to be my robber than me. This book is full of such great stories, and if we look underneath, we find the principles. And I said, the theme, well, really, it's not the theme. I said what is presented here is the idea of the home as both hospital and incubator. Really, the theme, if I were to put one word on it, it would be vulnerability. Vulnerability, and it's, I don't think, lost on her how ironic this is. In fact, she mentions the irony of course, talking about open hospitality at a church at the same time that you're being robbed. Vulnerability is something I believe we're called to as Christians, but I also know that as humans, it doesn't come naturally. We like to be in control of things. We like to think so anyway. We like to control our bodies. We want control over our health. We want control over our finances. We want control over our careers. We want control over our retirement. We want to have control over things that we do and can say, and control over other people's thoughts about us. We are control freaks, and it's one thing I think that we've recognized during the pandemic that Christianity can really speak to. That, of course, the sense of control that we have is a nonsense to begin with. But boy, to understand the ways in which God can really nurture us and use our vulnerabilities before Him, before the church, and of course before our neighbors as well. I think of vulnerability a lot with respect to homes and families, and I mentioned this earlier. She writes a little bit on this on page 108. If you're reading along with me, you'll find it on page 108. She talks about letting perfect love cast out fear, and Christian parents can sometimes, I can speak from personal experience on this, come from a position of fear in our parenting. And she writes, I think, quite astutely on these commands that we pit against each other. Here, I'll read it, just a couple of short paragraphs. We sometimes fear that our neighbors will bring into our homes problems and issues that we're not ready to discuss in front of our children. We pit the command to nurture and teach our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord against the command to love our neighbor. We must stop and think this through. So do you follow her? Here's where, the incubator of our home, that's the training and the raising up of our children, pitted against the hospital aspect of our home, that ability of our homes to be healing centers for those who don't know the Lord, who are broken, or even do know the Lord, but are broken down by sin, either against them or their own. We must stop and think this through. On the one hand, we of course must protect our children from harm. On the other hand, we must not presume that sheltering them will accomplish this. Perhaps our children need to know that when they confront doubts and fears, sexual temptations, moral and faith crises, we will not be shocked, offended, or hurt by this reality. And she walks through how, if you wisely and tenderly and astutely walk neighbors through hardships and through even sin, your children watching how you do that and openly do that can actually work to your advantage as parents. Now, I'll just say this. This obviously requires wisdom, and it's a big topic. And Pastor Andrew and myself, we are both experienced parents, and I think on all sides of the ledger with successes and failures. We know it's challenging, and we consistently want to, I think, convey to you that you as parents have to make these types of calls. Where do you draw the lines in your household? And I'm not suggesting that all of us need to have homes as open as the Butterfields have. They have certainly a particular ministry, and one that, as you read through the book, certainly looks a lot more radical than ordinary. But I do want us to think through, what does loving your neighbor look like for your home, for your household? How has God equipped you? And to recognize that need of control that we have as humans isn't God-centered ultimately, that we have to yield that control to God and trust Him. And if you want help to try to navigate those sorts of questions of where am I exercising too much control in my family's life? Where am I not free enough to be vulnerable to serve the Lord and to serve our neighbor? I'd love to hear that. I'm not going to make that decision for you because that's your call as a parent. Both Andrew and I would agree with that. You have to run your household. But certainly I might be able to speak with some wisdom earned over the years by both mistakes and successes. And I'd be happy to sit with you and encourage you along those lines. One last thing that I wanted to cover, I did mention, if you're going through this book, I know a couple of you are, it can look a lot more radical than ordinary. I encourage you to look past, don't be dismayed by the radical nature of the Butterfields' hospitality, and try to see the principles behind it. One example of this is, how does Rosaria, for instance, at the drop of a hat, entertain the thought of having dozens and dozens of people in her home, that upcoming Mother's Day? In fact, was it the day after? How does she do that? Well, for one, she's surrendered this idea that my hospitality is a performance. And she has a great little quote on page 111, where she talks about cat hair. All right, we live in a world that highly values functionality, but there is such a thing as being too functional. When we are too functional, we forget that the Christian life is a calling, not a performance. Hospitality is necessary, whether you have cat hair on the couch or not. People will die of chronic loneliness sooner than they will cat hair in the soup. And so I think that's one principle to learn. And maybe none of us will, at the drop of a hat, host several dozen people in our front yard for a barbecue. But learn the principle that, you don't have to have every cat hair picked up, everything put in its place, the sink polished, and then be ready to present a 3 or 4 course meal to be called hospitable. In fact, I dare say if that's your standard, you're probably not very often hospitable. And so that's the principle to learn from this, so that, if you're not having an open home every day to the stranger, to love the stranger, once in a while you are. And another thing I like, I'm going to have to close here, I'm not going to read it, but she also sometimes shares her failures, and she talks, and it's not even, actually she puts them though in a different light. So what someone else might call a failure, she just says, look, I obeyed the Lord in, she talks about Samantha, for instance, and taking Samantha into her home. Ended up being, by some people's appearances, not a success. But it was a success in the sense that they just obeyed God. Maybe I'll read that next week, because I feel like it's important to cover those as well, not just the glowing stories. All right. That's it for today. Really enjoyed this meeting with you, and trust you have as well. Tune in tomorrow for Pastor Andrew's Table Talk, and I hope to see you this coming Sunday as well. Bye-bye for now.